For those of you that don't know, my name is Bob Upton. I am the chairperson of the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground Renovation Committee. All of the folks behind me are members of this fabulous committee, this hard-working committee, devoted and committed, and they've done some great work over the years to make this cemetery in the condition that it's in. We are happy that you've taken some time to be with us this morning and that you will take part in the guided tour as best as you can, weather permitting. Before we continue, I'd like to recognize some of the public officials that I know that are here this morning, and I apologize if I miss anyone. First and foremost, I want to recognize Mayor Brian Arrigo. He's here. I also want to recognize State Representative Rosalie Vincent. She's with us this morning. We also have with us this morning Superintendent Cheryl Poppy from the Soldiers Home in Chelsea. She's with us. There are 44 veterans buried in this burial ground, and we will talk more about the specifics of the tour and all when we move on to that part of it. But I did want to say a few words before we did get to our tour. Do we know where the flag is? Okay, if we can all face the flag, I'd like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I should note that the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Francesco Urena, sends his apologies. He had good intent. He had planned on being here, but he had a conflicting commitment today down at the Bourne National Cemetery. But he is with us in spirit. He does live right in East Boston, and we've offered him a tour of our cemetery because we're so proud of this cemetery and those that are interred within it. As chair of the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground Renovation Committee, I'd like to recognize the members of our committee who volunteer their time and efforts to care for and maintain this historically important cemetery. We have Ira Novoselsky, who's the treasurer of our organization, Jeff Pearlman, who's our historian, Brendan O'Brien, Tom Sullivan, L. Baker, Bill Reedy, Annette Bornstein, Lenny Bonasoro, Nick Catanazzo, Lona Frangillo, Lenny Piazza, and Mark Silvestri. As a group, we work together. Thank you. As a group, we work together on fundraising events such as Bocce on the Beach, which is now in its 10th year, and we seek grant funding opportunities and sponsorships to support our efforts. Some of our members are here on a regular basis, almost daily, cleaning up, raking the grounds, cutting branches, removing leaves and grass cuttings, and even making repair and cleaning headstones on their own time. We've even been fortunate enough to have neighbors work with us in opening and closing the gates for our visitors to the burial ground. Some of our recent major expenditures and repairs include the installation of the main granite marker, which is behind us, installment of the brick walkway throughout the cemetery, repair of the main gate, major repair and rebuilding sections of the stone walls, tree removals and grinding of stumps, and significant landscaping work to remove invasive ivy which had been overgrowing much of the stone walls. Additionally, in recognition of his dedication and devotion to conducting tours and teaching the rich history of this historic burial ground, we've also installed the Peter E. McCauley Memorial Bench in his honor, which is in front of me and behind you. Peter was a dear friend and mentor to me personally, and Jeffrey Pearlman, and many of us that have such a keen interest in this rich history of Revere, and this burial ground is certainly Revere Beach. Our organization sincerely appreciates the work and support of the City of Revere, of course, the Department of Public Works, Revere on the Move, and the young teens from the Aspire organization who volunteered with us this past spring. At this time, I'd like to remind everyone that following the guided tour, there will be a time for a scavenger hunt developed by the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground Renovation Committee member Brendan O'Brien. We also welcome everyone back to RSCHP, the Historical Society at 108 Beach Street, for coffee and light refreshments to see and learn more about the rich history of Revere and Revere Beach. Please let me introduce fellow Revere Society for Cultural and Historic Preservation and Rumney Marsh Burial Ground member and longtime Revere historian, Mr. Jeffrey Pearlman, who will introduce, moderate, and lead us on a guided tour this morning. In fact, before I do that, Jeffrey, if I could, I would like to offer Mayor Brian Arrigo the time to say a few words on behalf of the city.
Thank you, Bob. I was enjoying the burial ground with my son. He's really into Halloween this year, and so he is especially happy to see us at a graveyard today. But no, all the work that's been done with Bob and Bob Upton and the Historical Society and Jeff Pearlman really creates a great environment for our community. And these are the types of things that, when we get an opportunity to look back at our history and look at some of the incredible things that have happened here and some of the important people that are here laid to rest, it gives us some kind of context of the region that we live in and the incredible Commonwealth and the incredible city that we live in. So to have my son be able to learn a little bit about, as he grows up, to learn a little bit about the history of our city, our Commonwealth, and our country, I am forever grateful for the folks who continue that legacy, and Jeff being the unofficial, maybe official historian of the city of Revere. I thank you for all of your great work. So thank you. I know the weather is not great today, but my son and I look forward to a great tour. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Arrigo. Thank you very much. Once again, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Pearlman, Revere's historian.
Official
Historian. We'll make him official. If not yet, so we will.
I'm going to make it official.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We are here today to talk about the cemetery, and for several people on our committee to give you a little bit of an education about what actually here lies in this cemetery, in this hallowed ground. The Revere Society for Cultural and Historical Preservation, RSCHP, is a wonderful organization. It's at 108 Beach Street. I am proud to be a member, along with a member of the Historical Commission, and also I am a member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. And I take my membership very seriously, as you know. I urge all of you to come back to 108 Beach Street when we're done, and hopefully become a member and give some contributions, as we all do, to people who may not know as much about our glorious city as they should. To begin, in the early 17th century, there were 3 cemeteries in Boston: King's Chapel, Copp's Hill in the North End, and of course the old Granary Burial Ground on Tremont Street, where the likes of Sam Adams, Paul Revere, and John Hancock are interred. But on February 11th, 1619, the colonial government ordered an official declaration because of a horrific smallpox epidemic that was sweeping across our area. I quote, "Whereas, since the abatement of the smallpox in Boston, many persons are returned to town out of the country, whether they had withdrawn themselves for fear of this contagion, and whereas complaint is made that the bodies of persons dying of the smallpox at Rumney Marsh are carried through the town to the south burying place, to the offense and hazard of many of the inhabitants who have not had the distemper, it is so ordered that all persons dying at Rumney Marsh and parts adjacent of the smallpox, their bodies shall be buried in some convenient place on that side of the water. None of them shall be brought over to Boston under penalty of £5 in money." That, ladies and gentlemen, was the seed that was planted that eventually blossomed into this cemetery. Now, this cemetery was not given over to the city until 1748, Where were our citizens buried prior to that time? They were buried in tombs right up the street here at Christ Church, which is the counseling center. And then in 1748, when Joshua Cheever, the son of Thomas Cheever, our first school teacher, when he bequeathed this area to the town of Chelsea, the city of Chelsea as we were known at that time, the bodies were taken from the tombs and interred here. The oldest one died in 1693, a woman whose name was Mary Smith. She, along with her husband, John Smith, no relation to the captain of the Jamestown Pocahontas story, he is also buried here. 1693, ladies and gentlemen. It's amazing. I don't know any other cemetery that has people buried in the ground from that early a time. If I could draw your attention to this stone right here. This is the Veterans Memorial Stone. On it are the names of many veterans who died from the colonial wars right up through the Civil War. And I would just like to talk about a few of them, if I may. First, Captain Samuel Sprague. Captain Samuel Sprague, who was buried here, was a Chelsea native. And despite the fact that he was in his 60s during the Revolutionary War, he gathered a group of Chelsea citizens and fought against the British bravely. Also, on here is the Reverend Phillips Payson. The Reverend Phillips Payson is a personal hero of mine, and I'll tell you why. He was the second minister here at the old church on Beach Street. And when war broke out on April 19, 1775 in Lexington and Concord, he left the pulpit and led a group of soldiers near the Battle of Lexington. In fact, in Menotomy, which is today Arlington, he actually cut off a reinforcement of British soldiers so they could not get to Lexington, which may have turned the tide of that particular battle for all we know. But what's remarkable about the Reverend Phillips Payson was when our Constitution was about to be ratified, every state had to meet to decide whether or not they would ratify the Constitution of the United States. Massachusetts met in Boston, and Chelsea's representative was none other than the Reverend Phillips Payson. When the question came up of whether or not a president of the United States or any politician should have a religious requirement, Reverend Payson, despite being a clergyman, said no. There should be a separation of church and state. Joseph Green and his son, Joseph Green Jr., fought at the Battle of Chelsea Creek and actually gave water to the soldiers as they fought against the British. The Pratts, what a proud family they should be. I mentioned Thomas Pratt, who started the grist mill on Chelsea Creek, which became Slade's Mill. The Pratt family also fought in many of our wars, including the American Revolution. So much could be talked about when we talk about the veterans of the American Revolution. Later on, Ira Novoselsky will be talking about North Chelsea's participation in the Civil War. Once again, if you're confused about our name, we were, of course, Rumney Marsh, and then we became Chelsea in 1739. And from 1739 to 1846, that's what we were called. So when we do research on Revere, we can't find what we're looking for if we look up Revere. If we look up Chelsea, if the event occurred between 1739 and 1846, yeah, we'll find what we're looking for. From 1846 to 1871, we were North Chelsea. So if you're looking to do research on the Civil War and who that lived in this community fought in the Civil War, you'd have to look up North Chelsea. And then in 1871, we took the name Revere. We were the town of Revere. And then in 1915, Arthur Curtis was sworn in as the new mayor of the city of Revere. And we've been the city of Revere since 1915. I want to introduce the three tour guides and where they are going to be. And then we're going to begin the tour as I talk about the slaves that are buried here. Yes, the slaves who worked and lived in Chelsea are buried right here, and I'll show you exactly where they are, and we'll talk about them. L. Baker. Where's L? L is going to be standing near where Dean Winthrop is interred, and she's going to talk about the son of our first governor. Ivan Novoselsky is going to be in the back near the Civil War, cannonballs, and graves, talking about those that are interred that fought in the war between the states. And Brendan O'Brien is going to be talking near there about the engravings, their symbolism, and how they've changed from century to century. Slavery in America, or as historian Kenneth Stamp called the peculiar institution, is almost as old as our nation itself. The first Negro slaves were transported to America in 1619. 1 year before the Pilgrims set foot in New England, several dozen slaves arrived in Virginia to work on the tobacco and later the cotton plantations. Involuntary servitude by both indentured servants and slaves was decreasing, yes, decreasing, in the 18th century until the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. This technology made the cleaning of cotton less laborious and created a need for more productive land and, of course, workers to pick the ever-profitable crop. During the 19th century, slavery increased enormously throughout the country, especially here in New England. Our town, known as Chelsea, was an agrarian community, and several wealthy landowners had slaves to help them in and outside their homesteads. To commemorate the 150th anniversary of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, our committee thought it would be proper to identify the Negro slaves who lived and worked in our town and are interred in unmarked graves. We are standing near the north wall, where history tells us that here more than a dozen slaves rest. Please follow along with me as I read the names, the ages, and the owners of these slaves. It is my hope and my prayer that we take away from this site the lesson that we are all brothers and sisters regardless of race, ethnicity, or religion. Please follow me. Ladies and gentlemen, the men and women listed here were slaves in Rumney Marsh, Chelsea, during the 18th century. Their remains lie interred in unmarked graves along this wall. We should never forget that they were human beings who contributed to our community's history. Jack, a slave of Samuel Pratt, died February 14, 1702, nearly 100 years old. Fortune, a Negro man, died September 30th, 1794, of great age, it says. Sampson Bassett, a free Negro, died April 12, 1826, age 86. Parker Bassett, a black boy, died August 11, 1818, drowned in one of the clay pits, age 9. Miss Ann Bassett died 1828, age unknown. And buried in an unmarked grave are Job Warrow, who died in 1836, a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And if you have a chance to take a look at that Veterans Memorial over there that I was reading from, you will notice that next to Job Warrow's name is the word colored, because of the discrimination and the prejudice that was so rampant at that time. His wife Betty is also interred here as well. Other slaves who are buried here in unmarked graves near the north wall. Charity, slave of Nathaniel Oliver, died January 13, 1760, 23 years old. Judith, a slave of Captain Oliver, died March 18, 1760, 47 years old. Priscilla, she was a slave of Samuel Floyd, died September 19th, 1774. Mark, slave of William Oliver, died February 12th, 1777, 28 years old. James, a Negro man, died April 3rd, 1778 at 78 years old. Margaret, a Negro woman, died June 30th, 1784 at 84 years old. Peg, slave of Samuel Sprague, died March 30th, 1791, age unknown. And a slave, Caesar, of Samuel Sprague, he died December 17th, 1803 at 100 years old. These were human beings. They lived, worked, and died in our community, and they should never be forgotten. Please follow me now as we continue our tour to the grave of the son of John Winthrop, Dean Winthrop.
Dean Winthrop is buried here. One of the many unique features here at the Rumney Marsh Burying Ground is the grave of Dean Winthrop, son of Massachusetts Bay Colony's first governor. At the age of 25, he married Sarah Glover. They had 9 children together. Dean's wife, Sarah, died in 1684 at the age of 55. In the same year, at age 61, Winthrop married Martha Mellows. She was the widow of Captain John Mellows of Boston. Dean also owned 3 slaves of African origin, and they are mentioned here in his will of 1702 as Maria Primus and a child named Robin. Dean died on March 16, 1704, just a week before his 81st birthday, in Pullen Point, which is in Winthrop, Massachusetts today. He was buried on March 20th, here in our local cemetery. Samuel Sewall, a prominent judge and businessman and printer in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who was notorious for his involvement in the Salem witch trials of 1692, for which he later apologized, provides this account of Dean Winthrop's burial in his diary. Quote, March 16th, 1704, Mr. Dean Winthrop of Pullen Point dies upon his birthday, just about the breaking of it. He was taken at 8 o'clock in the evening before, as he sat down in his chair, he sunk, first being set up. He vomited, complained of his head, which was almost his very last words. Hardly spoke of anything after being in his bed. 81 years old. He is the last of Governor Winthrop's children, buried by his son and 3 daughters. The pallbearers were Russell, Cook, Hutchinson, Sewell, Townsend, and Page. I helped lower the corpse into the grave. Madam Page went in her coach. Major General and Captain Adam Winthrop had scarves and led the widow. Very pleasant day went by. There were 6 pallbearers mentioned by surname in pairs on either side of the casket. His widow and second wife Martha died 12 years later on January 22nd, 1716 at age 90. The town of Winthrop was incorporated in 1852 after separating from North Chelsea. The town was named after Dean Winthrop's father, John. Each year, a group from Dean Winthrop's house in Winthrop come and lay a memorial wreath here on the grave of this early settler. You also see here Dean Winthrop's coat of arms, which is also displayed on the Winthrop house. And the Dean Winthrop house, which was built in approximately 1638, still stands in Winthrop today. And it's actually one of the last wooden homes in the country that has been continuously occupied since it was built. So you can see the pictures up here and probably drive by Winthrop and check it out. And this is gravestone there. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing that Elle said that's important, and that is that Judge Samuel Sewall from Salem wrote an account of Dean Winthrop's funeral. And as Elle said, he was one of the presiding judges who convicted 20 people of witchcraft in 1692 and 1693. But what people forget about Judge Samuel Sewall was that he later repented for what he did. And not only did he repent, but he gave much of his personal wealth to Native Americans and others who were less fortunate. Guilt money, I believe it probably was. Please follow us now over to the Civil War Memorial, where Ira Novoselsky will discuss those that are interred. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to Rumney Marsh Burial Ground. And I'm here to explain our Civil War aspect of our cemetery. The American Civil War, which occurred between 1861 and 1865, was the most horrific episode in American history. Approximately 700,000 Americans lost their lives during this tragedy. In other words, more servicemen were killed in our Civil War than in all our wars from the Revolution up to Vietnam. Revere was known as the town of Chelsea, North Chelsea, and during this period, hundreds of our citizen volunteers fought to preserve the Union. Here, behind me, interred is the hallowed earth, the Rumney Marsh Burying Ground, lie 13 patriots from North Chelsea who risked their lives for our grateful nation. John Sale, Company H, 50th Mass Infantry, died April 29th, 1886. Caleb Russell, Company E, Mass Infantry, died January 14th, 1863. Cornelius Nye, died May 11th, 1868. Joshua White, U.S. Navy, died January 10th, 1887. Samuel Cahoon, Company D, 1st Heavy Artillery, died February 4th, 1896. Christopher Richardson, Company B, 1st Heavy Artillery, died May 25th, 1896. Patrick Murphy, Company H, 48th Mass Infantry, died August 21st, 1897. Harrison Reed, Company E, 44th Mass Infantry, died April 23rd, 1904. Joseph Pratt, Company K, 32nd Mass Infantry, died October 12th, 1862. Daniel Kahn, Company E, 28th Mass Infantry, died July 4th, 1911. Thomas Kirwan, Company K, 17th Mass Infantry, died February 6th, 1911. William Cook, Company A, 1st Mass Cavalry, died August 31st, 1910. Lewis Bullard, Company F, 4th Mass Infantry, died April 3rd, 1929. Bullard was the last person to be buried here at the Rumney Marsh Burying Ground. There also is a plaque commemorating the actions of Charles Bibber, who was a recipient of the Medal of Honor and was killed in an explosion on the USS Agawam in 1864. And you notice at the very beginning of the cemetery, his plaque is in the corner as you walk in, but he is not buried here. He's actually buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Everett. These stones are clustered around the pyramid of Civil War cannonballs that serve as a memorial to the soldiers who fought the war. It was erected by William B. Eaton in the Grand Army of the Republic, Post 199. We citizens of Revere continue to pay homage to these veterans, and in the words of our 16th President, Abraham Lincoln, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have the new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Now, if you notice, The cannonballs are on my left. This was restored as part of our restoration committee. Several years ago, it was falling apart, and it's part of our package here. There are several members deceased here. There's a few there, and there's one on the walkway going out on the left. So I thank you for your time. Thanks for coming, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
Once again, as Ira mentioned, Louis Bullard, a Civil War veteran, was the very last person buried here in the early 20th century. Our final presenter is Brendan O'Brien, an expert in the engraving and symbolism of 18th and 19th century gravestones. Brendan, I'll turn it over to you.
So thanks for coming out on this ideal morning for this kind of thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the designs you see around you on the stones. I know not everybody comes to a cemetery for the aesthetics of the place, but that's kind of where my interest is. And there's a couple examples right here in front of me of how this tombstone design sort of developed over the years. Some of the oldest stones here go back to the 1690s. There's a few there in the back that are in fact that old. And one of the earliest stone carvers was a guy named Joseph Lamson, based in Charlestown. And he came up with a lot of the designs that started to dominate the tombstones in the 1700s. So his children and grandchildren also kind of carried on the practice, and we can see a lot of examples of their work here. This fellow right here, the skull with wings, the winged death's head, was an early example of their designs. You can tell it's very Puritan, it's very strict, it's very grim. For the most part, the men who carved these stones they didn't consider themselves artists. They were more tradesmen. They didn't write down the symbols they had in mind. But I mean, you can look at that and it's not too hard to figure out what they were going for. The sort of grim just presence of death. The wings add a little bit of hope that you're going to rise again, resurrection and stuff like that. But you see a lot of that in this cemetery, many others of the same vintage. As time went on, they started to soften their attitudes towards death a little bit. It wasn't necessarily a grim, scary thing anymore. And you get something like this here. These cherubs, these winged angels, represented that you were going to, have an afterlife. You were going to be resurrected. And it just gradually softened from the skull into something a little more friendly, a little more, pleasant to look at. As it continued to evolve, what we see right back here, the urn and the willow, and you see a lot of little plant motifs and stuff like that. But they wanted to get away from symbols that reminded you of, how, the grimness of death and stuff like that. So we ended up with going no wings, no angels, no reminders of that kind of thing, but nice peaceful images. Sometimes these urns will have initials. You can see a few over there that have the initials of the person buried there. But usually they went with this. Willow sort of covering the urn, and a lot of different versions of that design. There's also a lot of other unique designs in here as well. Some stone carvers just went with their own ideas. Near the Dean Winthrop stone, over there you can see one of my favorites, Sarah Williams. And there's sort of a bust, which we assume must be an attempt at a portrait of her. And there's a very cheerful skeleton holding an arrow that he's pointing directly at the bust's head. And on the other side, you see a flower that's wilted and cut. So you do get back to the imagery of life being cut short and ideas like that. So there's a lot of other unique things in the cemetery as well. And you see the various symbolism, artistic styles, and that kind of thing. So,
Thank you, Brendan. Well, I hope you learned something today. As one who's been an educator his whole life, that's the one thing that I want people to take away. Knowing something they didn't know an hour ago about this wonderful jewel we call the Rumney Marsh burying ground. I thank you all from the bottom of my heart on behalf of the committee to come out on this rainy cool day. And when the weather gets nicer, I hope you come out on your own and are able to walk through this hallowed ground and take in and remember some of the things that were said here this morning. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you all very, very much. Jeffrey, thank you very much. You are a treasure here in this city. You've done a great job for us on the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground Renovation Committee, also with the Revere Society for Cultural and Historic Preservation. You're a dear friend. You've taught so many children and so many people about this rich history. We can't thank you enough. I want to say thank you again to members of our committee who actually worked at the different stations throughout the cemetery on this guided tour. We want to let you know that there's also going to be available to you a scavenger hunt. Brendan O'Brien created a scavenger hunt. In better weather, you may actually want to walk through and look at some of the things that have been pointed out in that scavenger hunt. And I also sincerely apologize to Pamela Anderson, another member of our Burial Ground Renovation Committee and strong supporter of the Revere Society for Cultural and Historic Preservation. That was my omission, and I do apologize. Thank you very much for taking your time and being with us here today. It's great to have done this today, and I've learned a lot, and I hope you've learned something special too. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right. Hi, my name is Brendan O'Brien. I'm a member of the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground Restoration Committee, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I did over the summer, cleaning up some of these Civil War veteran gravestones. It's not a terribly complicated process. Basically, what I did with these stones here, you start off with just using a soft brush, something like nylon you can get at Home Depot, just to brush off sort of the excess dirt and grime, the stuff that's going to come off pretty easily. Once you get the loose stuff off, it's very important to keep the stone wet. Maybe I have a big spray jug that I use, wet the stone down, and just give it a really thorough scrubbing to get the dirt and mud that's really kind of caked on there. After that, let it dry a little bit, and then I use a product called D2. It was developed by a guy. His company is Atlas Preservation, and it was designed specifically for this kind of thing, to clean off gravestones. So you give that a really thorough spray. You really soak the stone down with this D2. And that breaks down the biological elements, your moss, your lichens, and stains, and things like that. Once that sets in, you could leave it if you wanted to, and it just works over the next couple days and weeks. It gradually makes the stone whiter. Or you could also scrub and do a couple treatments, and that's when you really start to see the difference. So most of these stones are, again, they'll never get back to their original state, but they're clean, they're legible. People who want to come here and get a sense of the history can see the names of these veterans, their divisions, and things like that. There are stones I haven't got to yet, and those are a really good example of what they look like before I got started, after years, decades, who knows how long, of not being cleaned and treated. So if you'd like, you can come on down and check out these stones, as well as all of the other old historic treasures we have here. There's going to be an exploration guide that you can pick up when you come to the cemetery to sort of lead you around and look at all the different aspects of all the incredible history we have here in Rumney Marsh Burial Ground.